listeners. And also you. Great, let's begin. James and I negate resolved the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. We observe that Jennifer Page of Harvard University explains policy reform can be justified in present-day terms. There's no need to call it reparations. Thus, in today's round, all our opponents' arguments must be inherent to the idea of reparations. Contention 1, dehumanization. Paying reparations necessitates monetizing African American suffering. Cooper of Otterbein University states that reducing slavery to a mere cost-benefit analysis connotes the inherent indignity of being a slave is merely a matter of unfair compensation for labor reform. But slavery was about much more than economic hardship. Slavery related to an assault on the humanity and dignity of African Americans. Bard College's Joel Koval gives the impact of this moral atrocity, arguing that putting an economic value on life, on people, negates the value of life. Contention 2, backlash. Rather than fostering good race relations, reparations will foster animosity, as the majority of people oppose reparations. In fact, Research News found that 9 out of 10 white people are not in favor of being forced to foot the cost of the payment. Passing reparations will only embolden people to lash out. Eric Yamamoto explained in the Boston Law Review that reparations directed towards Japanese Americans for their internment led to harsh government-sanctioned discrimination. One example was California's Proposition 187, which prohibited immigrants from attending public schools or receiving federal health benefits. Aside from the government openly discriminating against them, the public blamed them for America's economic and societal ills and voted to pass various discriminatory laws against them. Furthermore, this could materialize in welfare restrictions. Hannah Brown of Wake Forest University explains that lawmakers used restrictive welfare changes as a strategy to quell racial tensions in the past, as many felt threatened by other racial conflicts happening in the same period. Lawmakers are likely to pass similar restrictions which disproportionately harm Black people, which is why Walter Williams, a Black professor and columnist, stated, "I can't think of a better fortification for racism than reparations to Black Americans." Giving the government an excuse to pass racist policy only erodes the chance of racial harmony. Contention 3, trade-off. Paying reparations will ensure that no future action will be taken to end racial discrimination. This occurs for a number of reasons, the first of which is minority fragmentation. Noah Millman of the New York Times explains that reparations would embitter minorities and isolate African Americans, fragmenting minority coalitions. Given that minorities are already underrepresented in America's political system, change benefiting all minorities would be significantly harder to achieve. Second, it polarizes Blacks and drains political will. Thomas McCarthy of the Center for World Dialogue explains that reparations would significantly deepen the sense of Black alienation and leave those segments of the community most in need of repair even worse off, by draining political energies and resources and by exacerbating racial divisiveness. Third, tax wariness. James Bortney of Florida State University explained that an increase in the tax base shrinks the tax base by encouraging tax avoidance and even evasion. This means that spending taxpayer dollars on reparations will make Americans highly averse to new taxation and spending, especially if it were directed to Black people once again. Finally, an alleviation of white guilt. Lori Balfour of the University of Virginia states that reparations would give white Americans an excuse to ignore current-day racism. It would instill an attitude that reparations have already been paid, and therefore white America has washed its hands clean of previous sins towards African Americans. This is all detrimental because reparations alone won't solve the problem. Jonathan Blanks of the Cato Institute explains, a movement for African American reparations unnecessarily limits potential allies while focusing efforts on an unpopular idea that can't by itself alleviate the problems we face. More importantly, it'll make it difficult to pass policies that could solve the racial gap in the long term. Millman of the New York Times explains that the push for reparations might well stiffen opposition to other programs designed to address these disparities. Finally, existing social programs will have their budgets slashed. Brooke Steffens of the Huffington Post explains that the reparation may stretch the resources of the giver, causing him to cut important programs that exist in the status quo. This is why Glenn Lowry of Boston University states regarding reparations that it is problematic and bad for this country and bad for Black people, because it's wanted Blacks dwindling political capital and misses a chance to show genuine moral leadership in this nation. For all these reasons, we strongly urge you to engage.
Sam and I affirm the resolution. Contention 1 is the legacy of slavery. Census data reveals massive racial gaps in nearly all quality metrics. Compared to whites, the average African American is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated, twice as likely to be a victim of police violence, and twice as likely to be in poverty. These racial inequities are the inevitable result of slavery. According to a county-by-county statistical analysis by Harvard's Nathan Nunn, slavery has reduced modern-day income by 20% for all Americans living in ex-slave counties. York University's Niles Lagerlof then broke down these findings by race, finding that, unsurprisingly, African Americans account for 100% of this drop. The logical response to this systematic wrong is reparations. Reparations accomplish two things. They account and acknowledge the injustice that the United States perpetuated and help to ameliorate some of the gap. According to Brian Jacob of NVER, every $1,000 in cash transfers, by decreasing stressors to find money, increases graduation probability by up to 7 percentage points, an impact twice as large as current interventions. As a result, Dalton Conley of the New York Times says that $35,000 would eliminate the education gap, which is essential because according to Bruce Weber of Oregon State, each year of education reduces poverty risk by 39%. Contention 2 is the legacy of segregation. For decades, the U.S. pursued racist policies such as redlining, white-only summer construction, some-destroying mega-highway construction, and exclusionary zoning that pushed many African Americans into de facto segregated communities that concentrated poverty. To this day, NYU's Patrick Sharkey notes that a majority of black families have lived in the poorest fortune-led neighborhoods for consecutive generations. The effect of this segregation is devastating. Ta-Nehisi Coates of The Atlantic notes how blacks are 15 times more likely to grow up poor and worth 1/20th their white counterparts. Tulane's Stacey Saishadra finds that present-day segregation reduces access to job, education, and health services, resulting in large disparities in all of those fields. In fact, when Wall Street's Melvin Oliver conducted a logistic regression analysis on the wealth gap, he found that 75% of it was due to racist policies. This disturbing legacy provides a moral imperative to act. The University of Michigan's Elizabeth Anderson writes, "The segregation is an injustice, the remedy is an imperative of justice." As Boston University's David Lyons explained, corrective justice requires the U.S. make amends to fix the problems that the U.S. created. According to University of North Carolina's Alfred Brophy, reparations do just that. They require not just acknowledging culpability, but making a concerted effort to ameliorate the problem. That means the reparations require not acknowledging the government's role in segregation, but actively taking steps to desegregate. UC Berkeley's Dr. Johnson finds school desegregation massively improves all quality of life metrics, from education to earnings to incarceratory risk. According to Alana Samuels of Slate Magazine, integration helps reduce racist views among whites because it's harder to maintain stereotypes about groups when you work, live, and interact with them. Perhaps most importantly, Anderson finds other anti-poverty programs like welfare can never succeed without first achieving integration because distribution of resources and services can never be equitable as long as housing and schooling is still so segregated. According to Samuels, historically, when the courts have determined governmental complicity in racial segregation, they've offered vouchers as reparations. In two cases in Chicago, as well as Baltimore and Dallas, the courts required that cities issue housing vouchers in ways that differ from existing race-neutral vouchers because their goal is explicitly to integrate communities. These reparations are empirically effective. Will Fisher of the CVPP finds that housing vouchers reduce homelessness by 80%, and the Children's Defense Fund finds that spending $25 billion on vouchers reduced black child poverty by 25%. In the most famous reparations voucher case, Latrobe, nearly 90% of recipients moved into white majority suburbs, nearly 100% to amass the quality of life gains in education, health, and crime risks. In fact, UC Irvine's Greg Duncan finds that Latrobe cut the intergenerational poverty rate of reparation recipients by 50%. All in all, the U.S. federal government actively promoted segregation and slavery. Because reparations both acknowledge this wrong and make efforts to correct them, we are very proud to affirm. I'm just on the chords.
And then we're ready. So what about affirming ensures that your specific housing policy will be passed?
Because every single time in the past, when the courts have ruled that a municipality is responsible for our racial segregation, the form of reparations that has taken place is housing vouchers. Can I ask you a question?
However, every single example of the conflict, the U.S. federal government paying reparations.
Because the U.S. federal government has never paid reparations for segregation, which is our advocacy.
Okay,
Can I ask you a question though? Sure. You say in your first contention about dehumanization.
Yeah.
So when someone's spouse dies in war, the U.S. federal government pays $100,000 to the surviving spouse.
Yeah.
Does that dehumanize?
Okay, like the issue here is that the inherent indignity of the legacy of slavery is that people were given monetary value, that they were commoditized, so they take this exact same
That
action.
doesn't answer the question. The quote from you is when you put an economic value on life, you destroy life's meaning. We pay $100,000 when a spouse is killed in war. Does that mean everyone's life is no longer
Okay, no,
having
when we're
meaning?
looking uniquely to the legacy of slavery, instead of
You
creating.
said life. You said economic value on life.
Okay, well, like our author talked about slavery.
But your logic also applies when you say economic value on life, and then you say it doesn't apply when we talk about life.
So let me clarify, because
what is
slavery,
different?
because the inherent indignity of slavery was the issue with the fact that people were owned, commodified, traded, like they were not treated as human. By taking action, trying to solve.
Why
and
was
putting
when
a
you
dollar
die
value,
that different? Wouldn't that also be putting a value on life be
because
different?
like it's not an institutional problem. I think like because like racism and the institution of racism isn't solved by like a one-time monetary payment. We have to like we're making this issue about like monetary issues rather than like structural change.
I contend we're not putting a value on life. We're just compensating for a wrong. You want to ask me a question?
In your third contention, you talked. I'm sorry. In your first, you talked about inequality gaps, and you assume that like there will be all these benefits if we pay people reparations.
Yep.
How can you ensure like the African Americans are going to pay like and spend their reparations like on education?
We're not assuming it. We're looking at the historical studies. Now the studies have found is when you give people every $1,000, because that decreases stressors to find money, that means people go back to school and increases graduation rate
So if you give
probability
like
8%.
just $1,000.
Every $1,000 is scalable actually, which is what's so awesome about direct cash transfers. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
In your second contention, you talk about your one example of welfare trade-off is Proposition 187.
We also talked about payment of welfare.
Okay, but your example of when it happened to pass is Proposition 187. Question: when was that passed?
I'm not sure.
It's your study.
I can pull up the card if you want.
I'm sure it's 1994.
Yes.
That's what
It
your
was in the
author
90s,
said.
yeah.
So when was Japanese American reparations passed?
40 years earlier.
Yeah, so actually 6 years earlier.
Okay, sorry.
How is it causally related when in 1988 we passed Japanese American reparations and in 1994 we passed the welfare trade-off? Why is a 6-year gap emerging and how is that causally related?
It takes time to like pass policy, and what Yamamoto explains is this was a direct result of the backlash. It's not just like the government reacts directly. What happens is like there's backlash among
Quick
society,
question,
and the government uses this to
was
reflect
this law ever enforced?
Yes.
Can I see that card?
Sure.
Because it was struck down within a month of its passage. So it was never enforced.
Okay, in your I'm not sure if it's correct, sorry, can you have that? Can you see the study in which like $1,000?
Yeah, okay.
Can we also see the segregation here?
Yeah, Anderson and James. Anderson is Anderson is a flipper. We have pictures of the page, but the card is taking a lot of it. It is correct. So you know it's correct right now. There we go. I got one. There we go.
negotiations on the case. Okay, Sarah, ready? Opponents? You guys ready? All three judges? Starting in observations. Okay.
First of all, you can't restore justice unless you see benefits in the round, which means don't let them impact the idea of morality. The government is a democratic actor. They act in the interest of its people. But then second of all, racist attitudes in the status quo are decreasing. Each year we see policies that disproportionately benefit minorities, such as expansion of Pell Grants, affirmative action, etc. With that in mind, go into the first convention about the legacy of slavery. First of all, it's the wrong vehicle to repay. They basically describe like general discrimination in this convention. But the important issue is that the government doesn't pay reparations for general discrimination like poverty alleviation. That's what they use social programs for. That's our framework. But then second of all, it's not going to be narrowly tailored. Because, for example, only a certain amount of African Americans were enslaved. What they're trying to advocate for is paying all African Americans back, which means by the government's definitional standards for reparation, this wouldn't even pass strict scrutiny. But then third of all, they try to advocate direct cash transfers to solve educational problems. There's two problems with educational spending. First of all, you look at the University of Rochester, and in a 400 study-made analysis, they find that there's no correlation between educational spending and educational attainment. But this is really important because their own card says this too. But then second of all, you look at the National Educational Association. They say that when you spend money and from one education part of the education budget to another, you're diverting money away from public schools, which is crucial because the majority of African Americans reside in these public schools that they divert the budgets from. Then you go to Convention 2 on housing segregation. The important thing here is that it's a race-neutral issue. The FHA didn't only discriminate against African Americans, it discriminated against minorities in general, which means ghettoization affecting the other minorities in the status quo cannot be repaid with the reparation only to African Americans. That's discriminating against Hispanics and other minorities. Then second of all, remedies exist in the status quo. First of all, redlining was made illegal, which is really important because there's no legal basis to pay for these reparations. But then second of all, there's also social programs in the status quo. If we use housing vouchers, for example, to bring stuff in their own case, that can solve for the disparity. But then third of all, they talk about the idea that we have a moral imperative to solve the housing discrimination. Two problems here. First of all, the government just doesn't do what is right because they're not a moral actor. But then second of all, the government always acts in the interest of its people. And insofar as only 5% of white Americans and the majority of the tax base want reparations, these things literally would not happen in the real world. And finally, they say that the reparations are uniquely beneficial. There's going to be four problems here. First of all, the only difference between their advocacy of housing vouchers and the housing vouchers that exist in the status quo is that they're only given to African Americans, which means they are functionally the same. Then second of all, Badger finds that modern day housing vouchers will rarely work because the vacant communities they move into are more bad ones, which means you basically get a discount on a bad house. That's all they're advocating for. But then third of all, Badger also finds that you lead to worse educational systems, more crime-ridden communities, which means you turn their impacts. We're seeing that all these impacts that they're trying to advocate for are exacerbated. And finally, you also trade off with future beneficial policy. That's Convention 3. So for example, you might pass one housing policy on a small scale. We'll tell you the bigger picture is there's much more opposition to future policies and much more funding cuts, which means you don't solve the issue. But then next, you look at the fact that you don't solve the root cause. Because the root cause of housing discrimination is discrimination. What Jacqueline Bacon finds is that you increase racism with reparations. She essentially finds the media is skewed towards anti-reparations, which is really, really important. Because the media portrays the majority of the public's view once you pass these reparations, which ends up meaning the public will advocate against future social policies that will benefit African Americans. This is uniquely important in the round because the Nick can guarantee this. We see it empirically. And finally, we see more bad policy. This is the Japanese whose reparations were struck down within a month. This is really, really crucial. The reason that Japanese reparations might potentially work and the reason African American reparations won't work is because of the way the media portrays African Americans. They portray Japanese people as the model minority, but this is not the same treatment they give African Americans. They essentially portray African Americans in the status quo as thugs and thieves, which is really, really important because the majority of the public opinion, once you pass reparations, will not be positive towards African Americans. That's what we can uniquely impact the idea of more bad policies. Let's go over the impacts. We see this empirically because we saw like a restriction on welfare because like we saw this in Alabama and Georgia. What ended up happening is when you had progressive policy there, Black African Americans were punished by white voters with restrictive welfare and with less beneficial policies, which means in the status quo, we can see it'll only get worse from that once you pass a reparation. Let's engage.
Things are good? Sarah? Will? And Judges. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to have like an overall response and then go down the case. It makes sense to put it on either flow. I think it actually probably makes more sense to put it on our side. However, if you don't have room because of their overview, it makes sense in theirs as well. That work? Okay. So, before I get into specifics, there's one overall thing to keep in mind because the resolution is very clear that it's asking us for a moral obligation whether or not to maximize justice. That's really important because justice does not care about political expediency. Justice does not care whether or not people like reparations. Justice just cares whether or not the wrong done in the past was sufficient enough to warrant compensation today. They try to preempt this in the rebuttal, saying we need to be looking at the consequences. The problem is, beyond the fact that they're giving you no warrant for this, is the fact that they're only looking at utilitarian consequences. To be able to take into fact the bigger picture, we need to look to the bigger picture here. Now, into their first contention, which first their observation, saying that all these policies can be justified and not called reparations. Two problems here. First, just because they can theoretically be justified doesn't mean that after reparations this would actually be passed. Make them show the probability that these specific policies would be passed before you can grant them any of these non-unique arguments. But second, keep in mind that these benefits are unique. Race-neutral housing measures can't atone for the sin of slavery at all. These benefits are all unique. Now into contention one, which talks about dehumanization. First off, I just like to point out it's really ironic when they themselves are telling you we need to be looking to utilitarian impacts, yet are weighing dehumanization right first. They're contradicting themselves right here. But second and most importantly, the fact is my brother alluded to in Crossfire, is that we aren't actually dehumanizing anyone here. What Adrian Buñuel of Harvard University explains is that when you can't actually always use first best definitions of justice. Instead, sometimes when you can't actually atone, with the solution can't exactly match with the problem, as long as you use the second best method, it's still going to be morally acceptable. Will give you the analogy of when a spouse is killed up in war, we still give payments. That doesn't mean their spouse's life is worth $100,000. You're just doing the best you can to pay for their sin. Most importantly, let's do a comparative here. So keep in mind the negative is also monetizing the value of people suffering. They're just monetizing it at zero. At least we're doing a better comparative here. Now to the second contention, which talk about backlash. First, they tell you that majority of people oppose reparations, but that's just because reparations aren't currently discussed in the news very often. That's because so people don't have a very clear idea of what reparations would be. Once you discuss more often, you solidify these viewpoints. That's also going to take out basically half the responses they give on our case. But then they tell you this Yamamoto evidence, which is their only example of saying that you're going to be passing punitive welfare, such as Proposition 187. As my brother alluded to in Crossfire, that was passed 6 years after the passage of Japanese reparations during the welfare reform in Congress. It was utterly unrelated, and it was about restricting welfare to undocumented immigrants from Mexico. It was literally unrelated to anything we're talking about. But then they say that Japanese Americans were blamed for the economic ills. But that wasn't because of Japanese American reparations. That was because Japan's economy was rising at the time, just like China's is now. That's why we saw Japan backing. It was unrelated to reparations. Then they give you this impact saying welfare restrictions are ground, whose warrant says that when racial issues become salient, you're more likely to cut welfare. The problem is, and this is really important, is that according to Martin Grimes of Princeton University, the world's leading authority on the link between race and social policy, he explains that even race-neutral policies, which my opponents advocate for, still have these racial connotations. That's really important because he says, because in fact, when you make a policy racially explicit, you actually increase support because you're embracing the moniker A, and B, you make people aware of the biases that are affecting their thinking. In fact, it's the opposite of what they're telling you. Now into contention 2, which they weigh a lot, which is about trade-offs. First, they give this idea of minority fragmentation. The first big red flag they send up is the fact that they're giving you 0 examples right here. We've passed reparations in the past, and by virtue of the fact they're referring to minority coalitions in the present tense, clearly this isn't something that happens in reality. But most importantly is this idea that the argument doesn't make any sense at any level. If you believe, as my opponents assert, that minority coalitions are good for everyone, why would someone willingly try to sacrifice their own interests just because they're like envious of someone else? That doesn't make any sense because it's not acting in their own interest. Then on their second step point, they talked about political capital. First off, keep in mind you're actually going to be raising political capital because you're raising awareness of the issues. When you pass reparations, it causes people to be aware of the reason why you passed in the first place. That raising awareness of the issue puts it on the agenda, just making us more likely to actually combat these issues. But second, because reparations are this marquee issue, that's really important because it'll cause people to come together. So even if individual legislators have less political capital, the movement will have more political capital, making us more likely to combat these problems. Then they talk about how it's going to lead to reducing white guilt. But here's the opposite's going to happen, because when you pass reparations, you raise awareness of the reason why you passed in the first place. That shatters the illusion of the U.S. as a perfect nation, ends white guilt, and if anything, it's the exact opposite of what they're telling you. Thank you.
Ready for class? My first question?
You do, if the judges are ready.
Let's say we affirm. How can we guarantee that the government will pass something related to housing discrimination specifically?
Okay, because basically we're showing you that the probability is the highest. This goes
Why
back
does that matter?
because basically we have to pick something, right? So we're going to say that the highest probability is housing measures. And this goes. What evidence would you like me? How can I 100% guarantee it?
Well, I'm saying that you should be debating things that are inherent to reparations, like backlash and like trade-off, and not these specific policies.
Wait,
like
we'll give you
educational
that.
factors.
Here's why. Okay, and it goes back to the response. I think your partner asked the exact same question first cross.
Yeah.
Which is less. Yeah. So what Will explains is that when we've seen historically, we've seen it in the 70s, we've seen it in recent years,
There's
right?
a problem with that. Problem.
How can you
I
have
mean,
a problem?
I
Like, I
heard
haven't
it
given the
I heard it in
response.
first crossfire.
It's Will and I look the same, but we're not actually the same person, alright? We're giving you a different response. So here's something important. What happens is that when they sued in the courts, the problem of segregation exists, what the courts have said is that every time the remedy they say is that the city has to issue housing vouchers.
How do we know how do we know they will sue for segregation this time?
Because
What
we're
if they sue for
saying
slavery?
we're suing for slavery.
Or health issues.
We're giving you cash reparations, right? We're telling you that you're setting an absolutely absurd burden in this round.
No, we're
that
just
we
saying
need to show
impact is
100.
inherent to reparations. Like,
This is
like,
giving
talk
you the
about
highest
discourse, that's
weigh
pretty
this by
inherent.
probability, right? That's like a very easy way to weigh this. We're giving you the highest probability analysis,
Okay, you
one,
still can't
and
guarantee
second,
it though, right?
I can guarantee this is certainly the high probability, but
Sure.
second, and most importantly, we are giving you the inherent impacts up above, where we're telling you that
Okay.
we're proving you with the moral
Do
obligation.
you have a question?
I do, thank you. So, I'd like to ask you about one of the responses you're giving us in your case. So you're telling us that we're going to be showing you, for instance, that school funding, when you fund at the federal level, it trades off the school. Is that an appropriate characterization of your response?
Somewhat. Why?
Because I'm going to ask about it.
Alright, ask about it.
So, that assumes that the reparations are going to be coming in forms of, for instance, like funding schools, right?
Not necessarily. It could be a voucher too. Everything related to education comes from the same budget, right?
No,
Well, most of it.
there's separate line items.
Sure, but we're telling you, the majority of cases, when you try to spend on things like educational vouchers, it takes away from the public schooling budget.
No, because that, again, so that the answer to my question was yes, that it does require that you increase in funding for the public school budget. But that's not the most likely implementation.
No,
we're
not
telling
the
you
public
there's going to
school
be
budget.
funding individuals, and they're direct
Individual
cash
vouchers.
transfers.
Wait, individual vouchers.
What
still-
individual vouchers? You're talking about like direct cash transfers. That's not a voucher, that's like a bill.
And how do you know they'll spend it on education? Like, what if they just spend
Your
it on
partner
groceries?
again asked that question. That still
I know.
helps. That still helps. Because one of the main reasons why people drop out of school is because they feel the need to make money for their family.
Okay, but that's
You
still not a
decrease the
guarantee.
ability,
You
the stressor
can't
on.
foresee how people are going to spend money. That's all speculative.
No,
You can't guarantee
when
any
we
of your
spend
poverty
on
impacts
we
if you
spend on
can't-
anything, it decreases stresses for money. Literally spend on anything
Okay,
in the
what I'm
world,
saying
it
is you
still
can't.
needs your
What I'm
impact.
saying is you
Right,
can't put a
fine.
percent value on your impact.
You guys taking graphic notes?
Is everyone ready? I'm gonna start off the framework, go onto our one side of the vote, and go to what is on. Actually, I'm just gonna start with others. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, let's actually start off the framework. Our vote is secretly we have to look to morality. Remember, the government is not a moral actor. The government has never acted morally in passing reparations historically. What we see what actually happened is the government the government primarily obligated to its citizens. So the winner of today's round should be the one who shows you that the best benefiting African Americans. We do this in two key ways. In one key way, which is trade-off. Our opponent's first response, this is our third contention, our opponent's response, our second warrant of political will by telling it and increases awareness. The issue here is that Jocelyn Bacon said the media actually skews it, so it's going to be negative. It's not going to be negative, it's not going to be positive discourse, we're actually going to see negative discourse. All it's going to do is increase stereotypes and implicit bias, and it's not going to solve the problem in the long term. The second key warrant is an alleviation of white guilt. Our opponents made the exact same response that just raises awareness. The issue here is that while it might happen and they might raise awareness, American society is going to dismiss the issue and view it as done. The problem here is that the societal view is going to be reflected in government action and which manifests itself in two key ways. The first is funding cuts. Current societal programs that benefit African Americans today, like affirmative action, Pell Grants, the Jobs Act, that help African Americans, are going to have their budgets slashed. This is what the Huffington Post explains. Because there's a limited amount of money they can spend. Second, we're going to see more bad policy. We see this too clearly and purely. First, it's Yamamoto. Our opponents tell you that was repealed recently, but the only reason is because the media portrayed Japanese Americans as a model minority. That's why it's unique. And furthermore, we should give you Hannah Brown. The only example is African Americans, and our opponents only tell you that race neutral policies will have the same issue. They don't respond to our warrant level analysis. We're still showing you that the racism against African Americans manifests itself in bad policy. This outweighs in the long term because we're showing you that we're not changing the structure where racism manifests itself in society. Now switch to our opponent's side of the flow. They give you two ways of solving. See, the first is housing. This is problematic at the point where telling African Americans to uproot their lives is not going to solve institutional bias, and it's functionally the same as current housing policies, which don't solve the problem. Furthermore, they talk about direct monetary transfers, but they can't assume that the African Americans are going to spend their money in a certain way, especially at the point where their study only talks about increase in income and not a one-time monetary transfer. That's negated.
We'll be taking some brief running back. Thank you. That's an additional 6 seconds. I don't think we need to do this so far, have we? Okay, so we have a minute before. Starting on wherever you float, Sam sympathy. Okay. The easiest place to vote in the round is moral obligation. Their only response is that the government is not a moral actor. This is the is-ought fallacy. They say it's not a moral actor. We tell you it ought to be. And they warn for this is democracy has assumed the responsibilities of the people. So the people have the moral obligation, the government does as well. This is the easiest place to vote in the round because they're conceding that a wrong was done, and we tell you that it's sufficient from Anderson to warrant reparations. Easiest place to sign your ballot. Now I'm going to their consequentialist framework. We first link in into reparations to slavery. They say it doesn't need strict scrutiny, but all our African Americans are feel the effects of slavery, so it does meet their burden of proving of strict scrutiny. Then they read a bunch of responses why we shouldn't give increase in school funding or vouchers. Literally none of our evidence is talking about education spending. It's about direct cash transfers. And the reason why this matters is every $1,000 increase in direct cash transfers increases graduation rate by 8 percentage points, leading to a 39% reduction in poverty, leading into their own utilitarian framework, which in turn reduces racism because when African Americans are lifted out of poverty, there's increased integration and there's decreased attribution bias. Second way we link in is through these housing vouchers and paying reparations for segregation. They say they're already things following the status quo. Well, they're clearly failing given how bad segregation is right now. Then they talk a lot about how it's not inherent. But every single time in history in which a municipality has been found guilty of racial segregation, they have paid in this form. This is the closest thing to inherency we could ever possibly have. Then they read a bunch of responses saying it increases segregation. The problem is they're looking at the current race-neutral policies. The Samuel says is that the way we paid reparations in the past are different and that they're promoted at integration in the way the race-neutral policies aren't. Which means that when we paid in the past, it decreased the intergenerational poverty by 50%. We outweigh on 2 levels. One on the moral obligation, but second on the utilitarian way by reducing poverty and reducing racism, because when you integrate with people, it's harder to maintain stereotypes linking into the institutional factors they pretend to care so much about. Go on to their advocacy, they talk about how it's been linked to trade-offs. One, last time we passed these things, there was no budget cuts. The only example to give was literally not causal. Second, it's not inherent because the cost would come from somewhere else. It doesn't have to come from the existing budget. Third, they talk about why it's going to be assuaging all these problems. The problem is there is no reform that exists in the status quo that is likely to pass. They need to prove inherency, that if you negate the resolution, something is going to happen. It's reparations or nothing. This is the best we could possibly do, and it atones for the sins we are very proud to affirm.
So under morality, we have to correct justice in the
If to correct the wrong that we have done.
Oh no, I understand, but how do we do this?
Reparations.
So
As
any payment of reparations.
No, you
what
have
about it? Is it the apology or is it like the action?
So you have to signal real apology and make the efforts to correct.
So what's the difference between apologizing separately, which we already did in 2008,
Because
versus action?
people don't think it means anything if you don't put the money behind your words.
No,
it seems empty unless you're making some real gesture.
However, you don't impact on what people perceptions of people.
No, because the perceptions of people. Here's the thing: it's not a utilitarian impact. That's what you're missing. So you need to correct the wrong. The existing impact didn't correct them because it didn't signal real remorse.
Okay, right? When ever have you learned to act on this morality framework?
That's the is-ought distinction.
And
The fact that they haven't done it doesn't mean they ought not to do it.
Like they're an entity comprised of multiple
The reason
individuals.
never should is because the government's obligated to the welfare of its citizens primarily, not the morality of past action.
Okay,
So
you're
you
They're
saying
not warranted. Here's why. There's a thing called the is-ought fallacy. Government don't act morally is not the same thing as government ought not to act morally.
If the
And
government
what we say
understands that
is
only 5% of its tax base do want reparations, they would still
just
pass
because
it.
the government policy is unpopular, does that make it unjust?
That doesn't matter, the government still
No,
would
you
pass
just said
it.
95%
Wait,
of
wait,
tax
wait,
base.
stop. Just to be clear here, the affirmative very clearly can fiat that reparations get passed. It's ridiculous to say it would never get passed if
No,
people don't like it
But you
right
can't
now.
just run any type of advocacy.
We give you the highest probability of advocacy.
Well, no,
That's
you
the
just
in
said
American
possibly
reparations,
did.
we paid in cash, and when we didn't say the control case, we paid in housing vouchers.
Let's talk about
This
these
is,
cash transfers.
there's never been another form it could possibly take.
So wait, let's talk about these direct cash transfers.
Yeah.
The card we saw that like your terminal impact is like this increase in like education of 8%, right, or graduation. As part of the card we saw that there was an increase in incomes of households of $1,000 with children under 10 years old. And then it said if you scroll up that there's marginal impact. I don't understand.
Sarah, you scroll down to a different chapter about Canadian
We were literally
education funding. The part I sent you that I highlighted is really explicit. It says every $1,000 in cash transfers
It's not
increases
cash.
graduation probability by 8 percentage points. And that's like,
Can
I ask you a
pretty
question?
clear.
Yeah, go for it.
So you're telling us that if like, one of the things that you mentioned in your summary is you're telling us that people right now, right, don't like reparations, and that's gonna like cause the media to be against it,
No,
right?
the
'Cause
media is against it now too. And
Right,
so,
yeah,
like,
because the media is against it because the people dislike it, right?
That's not why, it goes, that goes too big.
Okay, so we've discussed people disliking it. Most people right now have a clear idea of what reparations would specifically entail.
How not?
Right. So how can we trust what people think about reparations if people don't know what reparations
So like,
are?
what's gonna change
You-
preparation?
When
what's
reparations
the
go into
vehicle?
Congress and there are big
Wait, wait.
debates, people generally will more
Okay,
likely to know what a reparation
What
is
is the
than this
vehicle,
hypothetical.
what is the
Like,
vehicle
like,
by
like, I
which
don't
people
think-
learn about congressional debates and things like that?
What do you mean? For
The
example,
How
media-
how does the
newspaper.
average person learn about what's going on in
I mean, I
Congress?
read it through the newspaper.
Which is
Oh,
media.
okay.
Yeah, it is media.
And
But
it's
the same
used in
thing
a
applies
negative
right
light.
there. That the media talks about reparations without actually accounting for what they actually are, because they don't know what they actually like, are right now, because it hasn't been defined yet.
Hold on.
Sarah, ready? Opponents?
Yeah.
Judges? Okay, so start on, general observations, then one voter in there.
All they can tell us about their advocacy is that it's the most probable advocacy. Remember, even in first and second crossfire, they can't guarantee it, which means none of their impacts are definite. But then second of all, on moral obligation, the biggest moral obligation, like we tell you, that the government has is to help its citizens. If the government knows that only 5% of the tax base wants reparations, they won't pay them. And if the government knows that they entrench racist structures, they won't pay reparations. Which is why, if you want justice, don't right a wrong with another wrong. Look to the real world implications. First, start on trade-off, which is going to be the most important argument. Is it that reparations are going to happen or nothing? That's simply not true. We tell you every year you see beneficial policies like Pell Grants, like affirmative actions that get passed in the status quo to help African Americans. Then they advocate housing and educational vouchers. On housing, they never respond to the idea that housing vouchers are functionally the same as the ones that exist in the status quo. The only difference is that they're being paid to African Americans, which is important. They don't respond to the bad return on sustenance, where we tell you you're going to be seeing them moving into worse communities with worse education, with more crime, which turns all their impacts on a substantial level. Then you go to funding cuts, and they drop Hannah E. Brown. They what we basically say that they're advocating temporary cash transfers. What we're telling you is that on a broader scope, the majority of policies get voted down by white voters, which are like more prevalent in today's society. But then next, you go into bad policy. We talk about funding cuts here, like the welfare restrictions. We talk about like restricting funding to current programs that are proven to work, as opposed to these hypothetical impacts they give you. So we're essentially saying there's going to be more support for a racist policy, and the root cause, which they don't respond to until grand crossfire, is the media. This is really, really crucial to the round, because we certainly tell you that Bacon says that reparation advocates are already being skewed negatively toward by the media right now, and it's important because they say that reparations aren't defined yet, but they also say that the biggest means that you learn about reparations is through media. And insofar as the media says that reparations are going to be negative, reparations won't have beneficial effects, it makes the majority of voters opposed to future policy. But even in the status quo, we see only 5% of white Americans want these reparations, which will make it even worse because you reaffirm their racial sentiments. That's really important. There's no more good policy. There's more opposition to like these beneficial policies. There's less progress in America. That's what we urge you to engage.